Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Krishna C. Nadella, and this is State of Mind. Today's topic is entitled Eastern Parent, Western Student. Moving away from home and going to college can be a stressful time for anyone, but Asian American students often face culturally related factors that can affect their mental well-being. Typecast as high achievers, Asian American college students often report feeling intense pressure to succeed. That same pressure could lead to a lot of shame and guilt, as many Asian cultures emphasize excelling and working hard all the time. This parenting style could be detrimental to a child's emotional well-being if they don't feel validated for who they are. Back with us today to provide his perspectives on the topic is Dr. Murali Balaji of the Hindu American Foundation. Murali, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Krishna.
So in 2011, author Amy Chow roused the entire nation with her idea of how her parenting style was referred to as the battle hymn of the tiger mother. She explained that she raised her daughters the traditional Chinese way: strict discipline, emphasis on academic success, and music lessons with tremendous amount of practicing. First and foremost, what is a tiger mom or tiger dad?
I think it's really a way of describing a parent that puts in a routine, actually an orthodox adherence to routine. There's obviously cultural implications, but I think what you see with how she describes it and how it's played out, the universal tie-in is an orthodox adherence to routine, and really just almost browbeating your child to follow that routine and follow it to what they qualify as success. So it starts at a young age, the feeling of hyper-competitiveness, the excellence, and then ultimately meeting the top performance. And all of this, they believe, can only come through routinization.
Got it. So before we really elaborate on this topic, let's take a step back. Help us understand the mindset of an Asian immigrant parent.
I think what a lot of Asian Americans, particularly second, third, fourth generation, don't fully appreciate about their parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents is the amount of sacrifice they put in. And why? Again, we can talk about the impact it's had on us in terms of the Asian immigrant parenting style.
Sure.
But we often fail to understand the place where it's coming from. And a lot of it is born out of insecurity. So my father came to the U.S. Over 40 years ago from Canada, where he had been for almost a decade prior. And when my parents had me, my dad really wanted to make sure that his children would never have to work two jobs like he did, never have to, shuttle from job to job, or live in lower income housing. And a lot of immigrants come into these situations, literally they say with like pennies in their pocket.
$5 in their
$5 in their pocket, some loose change. And, or for Indian Americans, pressure cookers, right? But the point is, they came from a very humble place. And what they always want for their children is a better life for the kids than they had. Now again, that intent is sincere and it's authentic. However, its implementation often can have mixed results. I can tell you that as I've grown older, I appreciated how much discipline my parents afforded me, because if I hadn't had that sort of discipline growing up, I could have very easily, gone directions that probably would not have put me in the place I am today. With that being said, the amount of pressure my parents put on me probably pales in comparison with other parents. And I think some of it is cultural. I think the stereotype, unfortunately, with Chinese, Korean parents, some of it is, I would argue, linguistically based. Chinese and Korean immigrants, unlike South Asian immigrants, are not coming from an English-speaking or English colonial country. So there's a lot of pressure for their children to learn English, to be American, however you define be American, yet at the same time maintain a standard of excellence. So when you look at Asian Americans, especially those who are children of immigrants, that pressure to succeed and excel is driven by, I think, two factors. One, their parents really want them to never have to return to that humble beginning. Right. And two, it also, their success is viewed as a family or community pride. Growing up, whatever I did well, my parents would be the first to share with their friends and relatives. Whatever I did not so well, they pretended never happened. And so I think that in itself lends credibility to the idea that the expectations put on by Asian immigrant parents come with the best of intent, but are executed in ways where the children just feel sometimes a sense of isolation. Sure. A sense that if they don't meet these expectations, it becomes a failure. I mean, we've seen cases recently of Asian American students committing suicide.
That's great.
Because they didn't even, they failed to meet a 4.0 GPA. That pressure is really intense, and we have to acknowledge the fact that within our communities, that pressure combined with our collective unwillingness to deal with issues like mental health can have disastrous consequences.
So one of my observations has always been with the Eastern mentality is that life is a little bit more like a sprint towards a destination, where, stereotypical as it may sound, the desire to become a doctor, to go into investment banking, to be a consultant, to get into the best law school, was the end goal, with no regard for life afterwards, being well-balanced, being socially engaged in society. It's to get to that goal and get there and check the box, so to speak. Western philosophy has been more about the experience, the journey. It's a marathon. Make the mistakes, scrape the knee, get yourself back up, and keep going. So not to sound simplistic, but is this really a case of Eastern versus Western philosophy?
To a degree, yes. But I would caution with making that too broad of a brush, because I believe a lot of Asian immigrant parents are responding to what they see as the quote-unquote Western ideal of success. And what I mean by that is the careers you mentioned, being a doctor, being a banker, lawyer, engineer, what do they all have in common? They're all financially lucrative positions, okay? So even the idea of knowledge capital, for example, when I became a professor, yes, it made my parents proud. But would they have been prouder if I was a medical doctor? Yeah, I don't want to get into that, but I'm sure in a lot of Asian households, that is something where, okay, well, give us a social status. Give us the economic capital that will ensure us. It's driven by security and stability.
A risk-averse nature.
Risk-averse nature. But also the idea that, the way that his success has been framed in the West is something that must be not only emulated, but mastered. And some of this has some colonial implications, but I would also argue that Eastern philosophy, especially when you look at, for example, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, have all predicated, and I would say Taoism and Shintoism, are all predicated on this idea of the long game, the soul's journey. All of these things of living and letting live. But when they're put into practice every day, it's kind of challenged by the fact that, let's face it, many Asian immigrants who came from countries in the 60s or before came for better economic opportunity.
Right.
And as such, what they had to do is they had to retrofit aspects of that Eastern way of thinking into a Western model. So the irony is that, for a lot of our parents, they wanted to raise, I'm using obviously my cultural identity as an example here, Indians in America,
right,
not Indian Americans. They wanted us to follow the Indian model. You go to public school, but when you come home,
right,
you're an Indian.
so
right?
You're physically in the country, but
Exactly.
mentally you never left your home.
Exactly. And so I think a lot of that comes from a desire to preserve what they see as the traditional way, the right way. Another thing too, it's not just Eastern versus Western philosophy. I would argue that it has more to do with the perceptions of Eastern versus Western morality. Mm. A lot of Asian Americans, and I would argue a lot of cultures from non-European backgrounds, view America, from a moral sense as being inferior. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so that's why they say don't go to the parties with the quote unquote Americans, right. Even though their kids are born and raised, they view that from a lens of you're Indian or you're Chinese, they're Americans. Right. An American is someone who can quote unquote work hard and play hard and still get the job, but we can't afford that. Mm-hmm. So we have to just work hard. Right.
So let's talk about the student now. You have one leg in Eastern philosophy before you go to school and after you come home, and you have one leg in a Western philosophy when you leave the house and head off to college and see your friends.
Sure.
Talk to me about that conflict and to the extent that you can relate to it yourself personally.
I mean, it is absolutely a conflict that can have disastrous ramifications, as I mentioned. My experience was a bit unique for two reasons. One, I think my parents ultimately were able to make some of these negotiations when I was still young enough where I didn't feel as intense of a pressure. In other words, for the first 10 years of my life, my dad wanted me to fulfill his dream of having a doctor. He for various reasons, he couldn't become a doctor, a medical doctor in India. So, he came out west, and he used to say, you're destined to be a doctor. In some ways, I guess that's true. I got a PhD, but
you did.
When I said I wanted to be a football player, or when I excelled in journalism, some of these things, it took a while for him to come around, and he and my mom ultimately realized, hey, this is something our son really wants to do. Right. He has the support of his teachers. I think once the teachers validated it, they were like, all right, do what you need to do. But I have seen other cases where the parents have forced their children into jobs and careers and colleges that they don't want. Right. I can't tell you how many folks I've met who are engineers, who are medical professionals, right, who hate their job, right, and only got into it because their parents bullied them into doing it, or emotionally blackmailed them. Right. And that sort of pressure is just tragic in many ways. One, it leads to, in my perspective, a life that is shaped by anger and resentment. Right. It can have that impact. And secondly, all of those things that you get from your parents, the good and the bad, right, can be passed down to your children. Mm-hmm. And I think, for example, in my own life, my wife and I, as we kind of work on our own family planning discussions, we've had frank conversations about what we would want to take from our parents, our immigrant parents, right, and put them into the way we raise our children, and what we would leave out. And I think that's really important because we sometimes fail to step back and say, okay, there are good aspects of having this Eastern perspective. Absolutely. But there's also the not so good, and we have to figure out ways to mitigate or remove them altogether.
So let's talk about one aspect which I think is not clearly understood, the topic of communication. Observations that I've seen have been that Eastern immigrant parents talk at their kids. Mm-hmm. They don't talk to their kids. That is, there's not a dialogue. It is a one-way conversation. Mm-hmm. One, how much of a detriment is that long-term? Because at some point the child becomes an adult. And then two, what advice would you give to students who are at that pivotal age, 17 to 22, who are trying to find their voice and, to your point, don't want to be bullied into do something that's the rest of their lives, not their parents' life?
You know, that's a very tough question to answer, because I think it can be a situational, context. But here's the bottom line when it comes to 17 to 22-year-old and how they feel. First off, I think the communication is not as daunting if each side cedes some ground. I think what happens is oftentimes when we feel like we're being patronized or being talked at by our parents, we shut down.
Right.
And maybe as children of immigrant parents, we have to kind of keep our ears and our minds a little bit more open. But at the same time, the responsibility falls on the parents to appreciate the fact, hey, you know what? I'm not raising a kid in Beijing,
right,
or Delhi or Karachi. I'm raising them, in New York or Decatur, Georgia. These are all things that they have to be at least appreciative of. And I think when there's some edging forward, maybe there's not an immediate agreement on the middle ground, but it at least opens the door for greater acceptance. Now, for the 17 to 22-year-old who really wants to do something different than what their parents are demanding from them, I think it's really just important for them to make their case and make it in a way that is spoken on the language and on the level of their parents. In other words, if your parent wants you to do X, Y, and Z, and they tell you this because it'll help you achieve this, and this goal,
right,
the way you might want to present that is say, okay, I want to do this because it'll help me get to this, and this.
Right.
However, I can meet you in this goal by still doing this.
Right.
I think that can go a very, very long way in reducing some of these communication issues. In fairness, I think a lot of these issues can be mitigated through the use of intermediaries. What I would urge Asian American community organizations is to develop mentorship programs and develop mediation and counseling services. And there are quite a few already, but make them more accessible and communicate them to these families.
Right.
There are Cambodian organizations, for example, in Philly, that do a great job of trying to bridge that disconnect between Cambodian elders and youth, especially the elders who feel like not only is their culture being lost, but the kids are leaving their Buddhist faith, et cetera, et cetera.
So I have to imagine yourself and many people who are children of first-generation Eastern immigrant parents, you're now coming to an age where you have the well-roundedness, you're able to survive that environment, so to speak, and can impart some of that wisdom to both sides, to future Eastern immigrant parents and, of course, their children. If you were to be that mediator sitting in that living room, what would you tell that parent that may be scared coming to a new country, sacrificing everything they left for a better life for their family? What would you tell them to the extent that they could understand that their child has to also have an upbringing that does have discipline, that has focus, that has an attention to excellence, but also it should have balance. It should have fun, and ultimately it should have memories they can look back on with such fondness.
It's funny you say that, because I really feel that Asian immigrant parents need to tell their stories more to their children. What I find striking is when I talk to a lot of my friends who are the children of immigrants, their parents rarely talked about their first days in the United States, their trip making it. Like to this day, I still don't know how my dad got to Canada. You know, and I want to have that conversation. Maybe I'll have that conversation after the show.
Sure.
But there's two things. One, it helps the immigrant parent convey their experiences in a human and empathetic way to their children, rather than talking at them. And B, it helps their children appreciate, not necessarily agree with, but appreciate the parenting styles that are driving them. Again, if they're able to make that connection on experience, there might be a little better way of understanding each other. And on the flip side, I would urge parents to really take the initiative to listen to their children. I think those insecurities, those fears, are grounded in just not being able to open ears and eyes to the community around them. And once they do open their ears and eyes, I think these parents do end up feeling a lot better about raising their children in a new environment, in a new world.
Wow. I think we can definitely say Eastern parent, Western student, but global world that we all live in. And I think that's really the foundation to start any dialogue.
Absolutely.
Murali, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a very, very relevant episode for myself and for many of our audience, and we appreciate your time and perspectives.
Thanks so much, Krishna.
On that note, that'll wrap up our show for today. If you like what you saw in today's episode, please like, comment, share, and subscribe on the following social media platforms at the bottom of your screen. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time, and remember, every life is a book, make yours a bestseller. Have a good night.